Welcome to everybody. In this particular video we're going to be looking at a detailed overview of the Jubilee class locomotives that I have in my collection. We're going to be starting with the LMS maroon liveried locomotives and working through eventually to those in British Railways liveries. This particular one, which is Leander, was the first one that I actually acquired back in about 1980, 1981. So this particular model, apart from the chassis, is over 40 years old. Now, as they were amongst my favourites class of locomotives, I decided to undertake some detail improvements to the locomotives. The main one being the replacement of the rather unreliable mainline chassis. So, well, certainly as regards to the early production runs of those models, and with the upgraded Bachmann chassis. And as you can see, the driving wheels are much improved in terms of their realism and profile, compared to the original mainline ones, which were, if I remember correctly, they were a rather flat, thick, silvered rimmed driving wheel without any profiling on at all. But I didn't leave it there. I decided to undertake some further smaller detail improvements to the class, which I'll illustrate. I'll start with Leander. One of the first things I did was to look at the boiler mountings, particularly the chimney. The profile of the chimney on the main line and the early Bachmann versions of this class, the profile was not quite right. It was slightly on the short side, and the actual shape of the chimney was too curved. So I replaced it with this cast brass chimney, which was actually manufactured, I think, by Alan Gibson, who produces an awful lot of detail components for model railway trains. So I cut the chimney off and just tidied it up and placed that on the front, on the top of the smoke box. Now, the other thing I did was to replace the rather flimsy looking buffer heads, and they're actually they're metal buffers. And obviously you've got the lamps on the front, and there's a screw coupling on there as well. So there's little added details there. The other thing which I did was to grind down the smoke box door handles, which were moulded on, and replaced them with a turned brass version. So we've actually got a freestanding, three-dimensional looking smoke box door handle. The other thing which was let the details down on this were the plastic safety valves, which didn't look very good at all. So they've been replaced by turned brass ones here. And as you can see, or I hope you can anyway, the accumulation of these added details have actually enhanced this locomotive to make it look a lot better. The other thing which I did, which was to actually shorten the drawbar on the tender, so that the locomotive and tender are much more closely spaced. And yes, it does go around the set curves on the layout, so there's no problem on that. Moving along, the next one we have in the sequence is Jutland. Again, the same applications of improved detail work have been applied to this one as well. The main difference being that this was one of the few Jubilees that had a double chimney, and as you can see, that double chimney is quite makes an improved performance, or rather certainly an improved appearance. Again, safety valves have been replaced with the turn brass ones. It also has the smoke box door handles separately fitted. This particular one is actually a Bachmann one, and the yeah, the overall appearance is a somewhat duller look, which is not bad in itself. Gives it a bit of variety. So it's quite a contrast to this one. So maybe this could be looked at as a bit more everyday service, as the livery would sort of dull down after a period of time. So moving along again, we've got this one, which is, that's Galatea. Yeah. Also in preservation. She started off in maroon livery and preservation with the British Railways number and designation. This one is modelled in the LMS livery. This one also is Bachmann, but it has the earlier Bachmann chassis, which in fact is the exactly the same as the original mainline chassis, but with a much better motor and drive in it. So the other thing which is different about it is the cylinder, the slide bars for the cylinders are plastic, and that follows the practice of mainline. Whereas if we look back at Jutland here, you can see that Bachmann on the replacement chassis later on actually manufactured the slide bars as in metal. So again, small differences are noticeable here and there. Again, the chimney was replaced. The safety valves, again, turned brass. Then we've got the separately fitted smoke box door handles, got the lamps. The buffer heads on that were all right, didn't need any alteration or replacing, so they were okay. Again, a slightly different shade of the maroon, but I think you'll agree that they're still very fine looking locomotives. Tender drawbar again was shortened to reduce the gap between the cab and the tender, giving it a more realistic look. And I think most of these I've put the crew in. I love the way that Mainline and Bachmann actually finish off the back of the tender. You can see the way it's all nicely lined out, exactly as it was in LMS days. It's a very attractive look to the back of the tender. Also, on most of these models, I've actually put real coal in the tender. Unfortunately, no matter how well manufacturers attempt to mould coal, it always looks what it is, moulded plastic. Anyway, moving a bit further along, the next one that we have is Glorious, and this is quite a recent acquisition. I found this listed on eBay, and it was going for a very good price, and I took a punt with it because everything about it was mainline, including the chassis. I became aware that as mainline progressed, it was only for a few years, 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, I don't know, I can't recall, but they went around that long before they got taken over. The actual final models that they produced, they seem to have undertaken some improvements to the motor arrangement that they had. It was still, from my point of view, somewhat overcomplicated when you take the body off and you think, well, why did they do it like that? Because it just seemed very complicated. Having said that, this locomotive does run well. It is fine. It's just a bit noisy. So that's a feature of the mainline mechanism and drive which they couldn't really improve upon. Again, it's had the much more correctly profiled Jubilee chimney, and I think you might be able to see the smoke box door handles a bit more clearly on this one because it's silver. So if I take it there, yeah, you can just about see it. On this one, because it was one of the later ones, no need to change the safety valves. They were quite well replicated, so they remained the same. Now, also you can see on this locomotive that it's attached to the original Fowler tenders, which most of the Jubilees received back in the 1930s. Now, I don't actually run, those that you've seen my videos of the running sessions when I've run Jubilees, you will notice that I'd never run them with these tenders. It's basically because I don't like them. I just think this just don't look right. But for the purposes of this exercise, where we're looking at all the locomotives here, we're going to be seeing examples of these with the Fowler tenders, because they did run with them throughout their whole lives, right up till the British Railways time. So that's why we've got that one there. Okay, moving along, we've got the final one, maroon one, which I've got in my collection, and this one's impregnable, and again the correctly profiled chimney. She's had metal buffer heads fitted, and also again the smoke box door handle is being incorporated, a separate one, the plastic one being ground down, and also fitted, yeah, I can just about see it there, yeah, and also fitted on top the safety valves here. Okay, now another little detail difference on this locomotive, it's a back to the model, it's an early Bachmann where they've utilised the existing mainline chassis with those nice wheels, and what they've done is to put their improved motor and drive in it. So unlike Glorious, this runs around very quietly in comparison to that one, although again they both run very well. Another detail difference in terms of the actual LMS identification here, a batch of Jubilees towards the middle to late 1930s were turned out with without the scrolled elaborate lettering and numbering, and this is where you have here plain block letters and numbers. I think that's called sans serif. Without the serif, without the actual elaborate finishing off of the actual numbers and letters with scrolls and things. So a slightly plainer look there. Looks quite Art Deco, doesn't it? Again, you've got the coal in the tender and the closing of the gap between the tender and the cab. Sort of moving on, this one is, I believe, one of the very first limited editions that Bachmann did. It's quite early on in their days, and what they've attempted to do here, and they've made a reasonable fist of it, is to replicate the first of the class Silver Jubilee, which was turned out in 1936 with, or was it 35, with a very special high gloss black finish with aluminium boiler bands and highly polished steel work. Now, it's not entirely successful because the boiler bands are actually stuck onto the the moulded boiler bands, which are already on the boiler and the firebox. There's slightly raised things, boiler bands on the model, and so it's been a tricky exercise to get them to fit. But overall, it's not a bad effort. I've not done anything to that at all. I did put the metal buffer heads on there, because the ones that were the plastic ones, even though they were painted silver, just didn't look right. And obviously got the lamps on there. Nice little touches. You can see on the top of the vacuum pipe there. That's okay. And the hook that they've given it of a shiny, polished look, as well as the driving wheels as well. And you can see the centre hubs. Now, the model's a confounded nuisance to use, because it's difficult not to pick it up now without something dropping off. And I've lost count of how many times I've had to stick LMS and the numbers back on. And there's no other way of doing it other than with paper cardboard glue, because anything else, I've been lucky with the sticking them back on, but I don't want to risk using super glue or anything that's quite potentially damaging if it doesn't go on right. So I've stuck them back several times. The reason the things drop off is when you look at try and find these models, you see them with half the bits missing off them, or they're put in the box with it and say, oh, you can stick them back yourself. It's not very easy, but that comes down to careless handling. Also, the box itself doesn't help, because the inset inside the presentation box is so tight that it's hardly surprising that some of these bits drop off. So I don't keep it in the box simply for that reason. Anyway, moving on to the next ones. Here we've got the post-Second World War LMS black livery with the straw and maroon lining out. This, to my mind, was a very attractive livery, and all the LMS locomotives that had it wore it well. Again, we've got I've replaced the somewhat feeble buffer heads with metal ones, and again the correctly profiled chimney. Can't see whether they're the ones I did replace, because some of the later ones did have brass safety valves at the top. This one is a Bachmann through and through, and there we see the coal in the tender as well on that one. Also the short drawbar between the tender and the cab. And moving on again, this one also in LMS black, but paired with the Fowler tender, just for a point of comparison. Again, the same improvements that I've made to this is the fitting of the correctly profiled chimney, safety valves, shortening of the drawbar on the tender. I can't remember, one of these was a mainline locomotive, and I replaced the chassis. One was an out and out Bachmann locomotive where nothing apart from the detail improvements was required, but I can't remember which was which. Anyway, that's the section or the session covering the LMS liveried Jubilees that I have. I'm going to be going on to examine the ones in BR livery. We start here with the BR liveried Jubilees, and the first one here is Orion. Now, this one is a very early one which I bought back in about 1980-81 with Leander, and again the same modifications have been added to the locomotive as you saw with the LMS versions. And what we'll just do is just have a look at each one of these that I have. There are some detailed differences amongst the grouping, as you'll notice as we go along. So the second one is Mars. That was a mainline locomotive, but with the replacement chassis from Bachmann. And again, you can see that the metal buffer heads have been put in. The finish on the locomotive is somewhat shiny. It's a satin, quite a shiny look to the boiler, which again marks it out as being slightly different. And as you can see, it's paired with the Fowler tender, again for comparison purposes, but I tend not to run them with that small tender. I'll talk about the tenders on these locomotives a bit later on. Now, interestingly, from a personal point of view, I saw this locomotive many times because it was based at Bank Hall Shed on Merseyside. Now, I only live just down the road from Bank Hall Shed in Bootle, and Mars was a regular performer on the Liverpool Exchange to Glasgow expresses, and I knew one of the drivers who lived in the same road as I was living in Bootle, and he told me that this particular Jubilee was a very good performer, and the shed staff would make an extra effort to make sure that this locomotive was regularly rostered for that service. So a little bit of personal history there with that one. I can't honestly remember seeing it with a Fowler tender. This is probably replicating it in its early BR era, the early 50s. I'm talking about the early 60s. But just to confirm that this was actually a Bank Hall locomotive, you can't see it on here, but the shed plate that's on here has got 27A on it. And if you look at your Ian Allen ABCs, you'll see that 27A is Bank Hall. So full marks to Bachmann and Mainline there for that. Moving along, we've got the doyen of the class, Silver Jubilee itself, here decked out in British Railways Brunswick green, lined out in black and orange. Just so I can confirm this, again, all the same modifications there that I've put on. The tender close to the cab, shortened drawbar, etc. Also, it's got the overhead electric warning flashes on it. And if that wasn't enough, it's got the diagonal yellow stripe across the cab, which designated that it was not to work south of Crewe because of the extending overhead electrification that was being undertaken at the time. Also, if you look closely at the cab and the number, you can see that Bachmann have actually replicated the standout aluminium numbers, which that locomotive retained well as soon as it lost that special high gloss black finish that it had in the 1930s. The numbers, the aluminium numbers, were retained. Now, according to the literature, obviously the LMS numbers, there was only 4 of them, and British Railways added 4,000 to ex-LMS steam locomotives. And so the 4, apparently, so I've heard, was actually made of wood and painted silver. But there you go. But well done to Bachmann for actually putting that on. Moving along, again, we've got another Jubilee with double chimney, and this one's Connaught, and again you've got some overhead electrification flashes on it, indicating that it's a late BR. I don't know when this locomotive lost its double chimney, but I've got a feeling that it lost it quite early on. I don't know why they kept on changing it, or whether there was an idea that they were going to give them all improved drafting with the double chimney setup. Possibly it just got lost, and there was no point to sort of undertaking any additional work on steam locomotives by the time we got to the mid-50s. So that's Connaught. What's next on the line? Now I can't make out the name on this one. This is Achilles, I think. Yes. On this particular model, Bachmann decided that they would finish it in a weathered, give it a weathered look, and it's quite a good rendition. Yeah, I mean the variability of the weathering, I suppose, is something which is maybe slightly lacking, but that's just being churlish, I think. It's a good representation of how Jubilees looked for most of the time that they were running around on British Railways. So I was pleased to be able to sort of get one. Sort of interestingly, from just looking at prices of these things, these are not so. These early Bachmann ones aren't so expensive anymore, with the exception of this one. You're still looking at 3 figures to pay for this. Because it's a weathered version. Again, close-fitting tender, and the coal, and the other little details as well: smokebox door handles, turned brass safety valves where they haven't been, where the originals were just the plastic version. So there we go. And the final one in this session is in early British Railways livery of lined black. This livery eventually was settled upon for all mixed traffic locomotives, but before they'd finally decided on the chosen liveries for the different types of steam locomotives, quite a lot of them were given lined black, and that replicates the old London North Western Railway livery, of the lining out being red, cream and grey. Just as another little aside, which again I've done on all of my Jubilees, is I've painted the buffer beams, repainted the buffer beams the correct buffer beam red. I find that the buffer beams on model railway locomotives up until very recently have been very much like an afterthought. But the colour is quite specific for the buffer beams, so I think that makes it stand out. Again, that lovely shaped chimney that Jubilees had, which was so characteristic. And what I did again, this was a mainline locomotive, an updated Bachmann chassis added, and red transfers lines on the cylinders I applied myself, and also on the wheel splashes as well. Now there should be a grey line there as well, but I didn't have any in my stash of transfers, but I did have the just the thin red line that went over the splashes, so I've incorporated those just to give it a little lift again. And again, we've got the nice brass safety valves on that one. The other thing I did with this one was the tender had British Railways written on it, and I sprayed that out and put the early BR emblem in there. So it now looks like is it Leander? Leander's been running around in black for quite some time. I don't know if she's been repainted again, but she gave us a good idea of what a Jubilee in black really looked like. I think they look absolutely splendid in any colour, and I will be showing some in quite a variety of colours as we follow on from this. Just as a very quick aside, what I'm going to do is show you the picture on the wall. I think it's been up before for those who have seen some of my earlier videos, and I do love this picture, and it shows a Jubilee, and the caption is "Storms out of Perth with the fish," and that Jubilee, that's about 1965. Again, typical sort of condition. It's not filthy dirty, but there is a covering of grime on it, and then you can definitely see that chimney. That's characteristic chimney, which the original Mainline and early Bachmann ones didn't quite have. It was too curvy and too short, so that you can see the difference there. And yeah, to me that sums them up so well. They put in some good work. This batch of Jubilees that are in my collection are the very latest versions from Bachmann. There are no components of Mainline or carryover from the previous version that we've been looking at. So it goes without saying that in terms of modifications, there is nothing to be done on these at all. There may be some modellers out there who might want to do a few things, but as far as I'm concerned, these just about are the finality for me. And as you can see, Bachmann have taken full advantage of all the latest production techniques and manufacturing techniques to produce what is a superb, beautiful model. On this first one here, which I think is Australia, it actually came with a Fowler tender, and I replaced that with an earlier Bachmann tender, obviously in LMS maroon, which would suit a Jubilee or a Scott, with a little bit of jiggery pokery underneath the tender. Managed to secure it with a drawbar connection, and it works fine. But for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you will be able to notice that there are some very, very minuscule errors on the first rendition of the Stanier tender that Bachmann did, and it essentially comes down to the way this sweeps down here, but it's so minor as to be almost insignificant. The next one along the line is Hong Kong, and that is in BR lined out green with the early emblem on the tender. And I think you should be able to notice the slightly different way the swept down curve here manifests itself compared to this. It's very minor, but it's nothing that to get too worried about. And as you can see, the proportions are absolutely perfect in these models. I think on these two I did actually put metal head buffers. I wasn't totally enamoured with them as they were on then. Now, having said that, these now are about 20 years old, because I got these in the early 2000s, and as we see when we move on, there is no electrical connection with the tender for DCC sound, which is usually placed in the tender. It's just a straight pivoted connection into a drawbar. But the later versions, there's a permanent connection with the tenders, which does make them a bit tricky, because I can't do anything about the distance between the tender and the cab, which, if I've got to be pickety with these, I find them just a bit excessive. But that's just a small point. Moving on, these are absolutely beautiful models now. Again, there's a refinement in the finish. This one is it cashmere? No, it's not cashmere, it's Madras. That's right, cashmere was another one they made. I was looking at that. This one's Madras. And this is in a bit of a hybrid livery. It's LMS lined out black with the straw and dark maroon lining, but with British Railways on the tender, British Railways number, and the style is sort of British Railways lettering and numbering, as opposed to the LMS shape and style of lettering. The other thing to sort of look at it is the extremely fine riveting on the tender. And we can just about pick that out. It goes without saying that these models run so beautifully smoothly as well, surpassing those of the earlier versions. Not that the earlier versions were particularly poor in that respect, but they were. But you can just sense the improvement that comes along with the passage of time. The next one along the line is in a very exotic livery. This one is Ceylon, and she's decked out in which I believe is LNER green, but with LNWR lining, which is red, cream and grey. I think the colour works, and it could have done with some other lining on it, but I'm not sure that the red, cream and grey works very well. Be that as it may, 3 Jubilees were thus treated, and they were shown around the country to ascertain, favourability or otherwise. But needless to say, it didn't last long. But again, full marks to Bachmann for actually including this as another variety. And what I'm going to do now is point out the essential main difference and the big improvement between the essentially mainline manufactured tooled model and this very latest Bachmann version, which captures the locomotive so well. Now, the main difference and the most glaring difference between the earlier version of the Jubilee and the later version is the height between the running plate and the boiler. That is the most obvious mistake that has been in the model. Now, if we pan back to Ceylon, you can see that the large 6'9" driving wheels and the foot plating is much higher up. The giveaway, I suppose, is yes, looking it sort of straight on like this, but if you look at the sweep down under the cab, the way the foot plating goes under the cab there, you can see there's quite a drop and a curve round. Whereas if we look at Glorious here, which is the earlier version, it is not nearly so pronounced, and so this foot plating is a lot lower than the one on the latest Bachmann ones. The other things to note is that the cylinders are much more to scale, and so are the bogie wheels at the front. They're larger, and if we pan back to Glorious, you can see that these cylinders are quite underrepresented, and also the steam chests above the cylinders or on the end here are far too extended, and the wheels are a bit on the smaller side. Now, all of these things can add up to making the loco look a bit on the small side, but actually when you put them side by side, and lengthwise and everything, they're virtually identical. So it's a detail difference. I think also, if you look at the taper on the earlier locomotive, it's quite fierce, and I think when you look at certain photographs of Jubilees back in the day, according to how the camera lens was, whether it was panned or whether it was telephotoed, the Jubilees always did seem to have a very fiercely tapered boiler. Whereas if you look them straight on, side on, yes, you can definitely see the taper, but it's not as pronounced. So some modelling detail differences there. But I think these are just absolutely fabulous. And I even like the earlier versions. And if I do say it myself, I think I've made some improvements which actually bring them up a bit more and make them look less dated on the layout, because they have got the key features in combination, which I think bring them up to standard, shall we say. So it's all really a question of proportion and small details, I think. What I will say is that when these things came out, the earlier Bachmann ones, just reverting to them again, by Jove, they must have set a fire underneath Hornby when these appeared, because people must have, remember the reactions to them. People were very blown away, but we look back on them now and say, there's a few things here which are not quite right. Now we've reached the stage where we're looking at almost perfection, but there it is. Some history about these locomotives came in 1934. There was a crying need for an intermediate express locomotive that could cover all the main lines across the country, the LMS system, that was regarded as the second tier of expresses, say from York to Bristol, sort of Derby to Glasgow, or Leicester to Glasgow, that sort of thing. The LMS had put in hand the Patriot class, which were a small development of the Royal Scots with a smaller boiler, and using existing components and features of the Fowler era. And the Jubilees were regarded as a taper boiler version of them. The problem was that when they entered service, they were something of a disappointment. The locomotives turned out to be, let's not beat about the bush, poor steamers. And when crews are faced with poor locomotives which are poor steamers, as far as they're concerned, they're dead in the water. So an awful lot of work had to go on to rectify the problems with the Jubilees. There were three things that were wrong with them, and the three things weren't necessarily connected, which again sort of led to a lot of head scratching back in the drawing office and in the mechanical engineering departments to get them right. I do believe that it was Robin Riddles that was tasked with sorting out the problems on the Jubilees, and all credit to Stanier, because he wasn't willing to accept them as they were. He wanted them sorted out and sorted out quickly. And of course Robin Riddles was his personal assistant in the engineering department, and he went on later to design the BR standards in the late 40s, early 50s. So the three things that were turned out to be wrong were the boiler proportions. So one of the what they did with that was to sort of reconstitute the number of small tubes vis-a-vis large tubes in the boiler, and they increased the number of small tubes in proportion to large tubes, and by doing so they increased the heating surface. So that was one factor which was thought would certainly improve the boilers from a steaming capacity. The second thing which was identified, and this was identified almost by default, was that the blast pipe arrangements were not doing the job of drawing the fire in the way it should. And the way they found that one out was that unofficially shed foreman had been placing a jumper top or piece of metal across the blast pipe to split it and thereby sharpen the draw and the blast to improve the steaming. So it was like an ad hoc thing which had been done on sheds to get something of a better performance out of these engines. So a number of experimentations took place with different blast pipe arrangements, and what they eventually did, and it's unbelievable to imagine just how, what sort of like 5/8 of an inch would make in difference, but the dimensions were critical, and they reduced the size of the blast pipe after several different attempts, finally got it to the one that was necessary, and the engine steamed much better. The other weakness, which again was not necessarily related to steaming, was the low superheat. And that was a carryover by Stanier, which he took with him to the LMS, because apparently on the GWR, low superheat wasn't a problem. Subsequent history showed that was may have been a fault that the GWR tended to cover up. But that being said, they did have an almost unlimited supply to South Wales steaming coal on the GWR, plus the die-hard commitment of their crews that the products from Swindon were the best. Moving to the LMS, the coal variety was much more varied, and you were dealing with crews and maintenance from different traditions. So they increased the superheater elements from 14 to 24, and that improved the efficiency of the locomotive. So it burned less coal and consumed less water. So it helped to produce steam much more readily. But poor steaming is not necessarily caused by low superheat. The Black Fives had also low element, 2 elements superheaters, but the boiler steamed very well. But putting all these 3 things together, boiler proportions, blast pipe reduced, and doubling up on the superheater elements, turned these locomotives into really good performers, and they performed their duties well for right up until the 1960s. They were the very last purely designed express passenger steam locomotive to operate on British Railways, just outliving the Bullied Pacifics by a few months. And the final small allocation that Holbeck had put in some fine performances over the Settle and Carlisle in 1967, right up certainly as to the end of the summer timetable. Fortunately, we've got 4 of these engines preserved, and today they can be seen again performing very well indeed on the Mainline and on preserved lines. So without any further ado, that's my overview of the LMS Jubilees in my collection, with a bit of a background on the models and also the prototypes as they operated in service. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for watching, and look forward to seeing you again in the next upload.